Okay, thank you very much everyone for coming today. I was really keen for us to get together as a university community rather than as an official university event. I'm really pleased that we've got Stephen Wordsworth from CARA with us today, who's going to tell us a little bit more about CARA's work. But I'm also especially pleased that we've got one of our own in-house experts, Christina, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the situation in the Middle East. But before I pass over to Stephen and Christina, I wanted to say a little bit about why I've organised the event, what the university is already doing in this area, and what I hope to get out of today. The first thing to say is that I've exploited my office as Pro-Vice-Chancellor to organise the event, but I've not organised this event as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the university. I'm really keen that we come together as individuals, as staff, as students, as graduates of the university, rather than this being a directive from management of something that we need to do. It's very difficult when you see those pictures on the news every night in our nice, comfortable homes to know what we can possibly do here in our nice, safe environment. And I picked up on social media over the summer something that was happening at the University of Naples, where they were trying to teach local refugees Italian to help them cope in that local environment. And I was thinking, what could we do here in Reading? And I talked to some colleagues, I talked to Roz, and thought, well, actually, there isn't a queue of people sitting outside the university waiting for help on English language. So what can we do? I was aware that the university already had a long-standing relationship with CARA. I don't know how long the relationship has been, but I mean, CARA has existed since 1933. The university's been around since before then, so possibly for a very long time. And Shirin from our international office had been working with CARA and had devised a new scheme by which we would guarantee a scholarship to a CARA-supported postgraduate student every year. And I'm pleased that we've got that scheme up and running. And we also make it's only a small donation, but we make a small donation as a university to CARA each year towards their operating costs. But I was really keen to think about what we as individuals might be able to do. And so I thought, let's develop a scheme where we can help some visiting scholars, colleagues of ours who are working in universities overseas, or perhaps not working in universities overseas because of the environments that they're in, and to give them an opportunity, a bit of respite, a bit of an opportunity to refresh, and a bit of an opportunity for us to connect with them. And I know that what I'm proposing is a drop in the ocean, but I think that, those little drops all add together, and if we can all, imagine if every university did, had one placement. So look, unashamedly, I'm asking you for money. I've set myself a target of raising maybe £20,000 a year that we could use to work with CARA to support one or two individuals to spend some time here. Now, I have to say that the link for this scheme went live a couple of days ago, and we haven't promoted it yet, but already we've got about £2,000 worth of money in the pot and pledges, and it makes me think that maybe £20,000 just wasn't ambitious enough. But look, I don't want to make this just about money for this scheme, and colleagues may have lots of other good ideas about how we can help. And I don't want this to be something that the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Global Engagement is leading. I'm keen to find colleagues around the university, that can help give this some momentum. So look, if you're able to give us some money, I'd be very happy and very grateful. And I think Ed has put details around the room of how you might be able to do that. And if he's not done it yet, he will do. And if that's not enough, please ask me, ask Ed Pickering here from the Development Office, or other colleagues from the Development Office. I can see there's a row of them there, of how to do it. But if you've got other ideas, and it's, you've not got money to add to the pot, but you've got other ideas, please talk to us, and let's think about a way in which we can do more together as a community. I think that's all I want to say, and I'm keen for us now to hear from people who know much more about the environment and the kind of situation that our colleagues are facing in the Middle East, and also about CARA's work and how institutions, other universities and ourselves can work with CARA so that we can achieve more together. So thank you very much. And I think, Christina, you're going to go first.
Thank you. I've been thinking about what to say for the last few weeks, and I've changed my mind many times. So I've come without PowerPoint slides because I decided to change yet again this morning when I saw the update from the Daily Mail on the cartoon that some of you might have seen of rats pouring into Europe, and I was just so angry about that. As it so coincided, I was also dealing with some madness in my new apartment in Reading, and that's a whole nother story about how a move is the most stressful thing you can do, at least when you live in a peaceful environment. And also the busy preparations for Thanksgiving dinner as my American family arrives, and there is a turkey to be stuffed. And at the same time, there were images of freezing hungry people on the television screen, and people walking around in t-shirts and in sandals while the snow was gently falling on the Bavarian border where my German family lives. And I had to switch off the images, and I couldn't help but think that nobody in their straight mind leaves their home on the promise of a free handout, because it's just way too precious. So there was a combination of feeling extremely emotional and very personally involved in this. I work on the Middle East. That's my real passion, is that of being a Middle East scholar, especially on Yemen. The disappearing war in Yemen that has hardly made the media drove me to despair, has made me cynical, and I can't separate the academic from the personal at all. So I'm trying to bridge this gap, and hope you can forgive me for being not so much of an academic in this very moment, but most of all me, and that's what you get, I'm afraid. So by way of background, so the Middle East is my one leg, and I also, as some of you may know, I teach the terrorism studies program at the university, simply because 9/11 hijacked the field of Middle East studies. But I mentioned this because some of that background is floating into the comments I want to make later on. What really occupies most of my work right now is a project funded by the British Academy called Disappearing War, that looks at what is erased from our consciousness in this moment in time about war, what is hidden from our view, what do we not actually know about war. And that's a bit of an illusion, I guess, in this moment that is so marked by handies and instant internet access and images overwhelming us, that we seem to think that on the one hand, we really do know what is going on out there. We know what is happening in conflict zones. I like to think of that as a grand illusion, because these images are still distorted. And there's a lot of it that is lacking from these images. And what is predominantly lacking from it is the humanitarian cost. The actual suffering that civilians endure simply cannot be communicated. Sometimes we do see images of, as I said earlier, of people suffering, but when it comes to the communication of what that actually means, even I, who's trying to study this for years, simply cannot comprehend what my friends have gone through and are going through at this moment in time, having lived through peace my entire life. So I'm humbled by this project. But to give you a few insights of this image, things that we have picked out throughout this project so far are what is missing are numbers. We think we have statistics, but it is an example of the collateral damage in the Iraq War. The numbers even are extremely vague. They range from 100,000 to 600,000. So the damage. Imagine you lose a loved one in a war that is of no fault of your own, and all that there is left is you may or may not become a statistic. I've tried to imagine many times what it would be like if it was my house that was shut down by a drone, or somebody in my family died in a checkpoint, and this is not how we understand war. Still, there are factual political issues that, as a political scientist, I look at, things like lines drawn in the sand, the creation of the Middle East, and the responsibility for the problems that we, to some extent, have erased from our consciousness. Certainly my students tend to not remember these things when they come into their third year. They eagerly then pick up on it and develop a new consciousness. But it's interesting to see a collective forgetting about the entire region and what has happened there throughout even just the last 70 years. There is the issue of responsibility that is difficult to fudge, and it's not a popular topic to talk about. But there is, to my mind, a need to remind ourselves that living in the UK, we've had a great role in creating the Middle East, in creating borders, in bringing leaders into positions of power that have not exactly been benign. The involvement in wars in Iraq and Libya that have devastated countries, that have now produced a situation where people are fleeing in grand numbers. And also, and here's the terrorism studies bit that I alluded to, that Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a direct consequence of the war in 2003, something that is probably conveniently forgotten, or maybe just not known because these links are really complicated and not easily disentangled. Certainly not something you can so easily communicate in a 2-minute time slot on public evening news. I've tried that, it didn't go down so very well. So to this day I wonder what would I do if I was in a situation of war and crisis. This is a political problem, above all, the current refugee crisis, and we have not addressed this in a meaningful way. What bothers me tremendously is that the responses we've had have been one of more airstrikes, maybe contemplating airstrikes, and maybe more airstrikes, and that's where our engagement has ended. And that obviously has failed in the last 10 years, and it's not likely going to produce more meaningful results at the moment. But I guess what I'm also concerned about, what I'm probably most concerned about living here, is how the refugee crisis is affecting politics at home. And the rise of right-wing extremism is one that predominantly weighs on my mind, and I am very, very uneasy, and that's putting it mildly, when I have people tell me we should just close the borders and we should not have people coming in here. That goes against having a responsibility, humanitarian issues, but above all, it goes against the fact that we live in a global world. We cannot close borders and people that are, there's free flows of ideas, free flow of people. We can't undo globalization. Terrorism studies will add an interesting dimension to this, because the main threat that comes from terrorism doesn't actually come from abroad, it comes from within. As much as the idea of homegrown terrorism is a complicated one, and that's a separate lecture and not something that can fit in 15 minutes, it's people who will become terrorists are most likely already here. They have European passports, and they're probably upset in part because of a tremendous backlog of political issues that enrage people. And this is not to say that flying airplanes into buildings and suicide bombing activities are an adequate response to dealing with political problems. As a political scientist, and as a person, individual, this is not acceptable. But the chance of dying in a terrorist incident, and maybe that's in the light of the Paris drama that we have just seen, the chance of dying in a terrorist attack is significantly less likely than of you drowning in a bathtub. And maybe that is something to be kept in mind in moments like this, where we see overreaction that remind me very much of what happened post 9/11. I look to Brussels and I see a Christmas market that is boarded up, and I wonder, images that come to my mind are that of a police state in an overreaction to terrorism that have me much more concerned than the actual threat of terrorism itself. I'm bringing in a lot of different issues, but I hope you can forgive me for not being able to identify and keep them neatly apart. It brings me down to the question of how to deal with this crisis, that political crisis that we currently face. And there are no easy and simple answers to that. And it's easy, of course, for me to be the academic who can retreat, criticize, and then not offer any meaningful alternatives. That's, great, the great position of being in the opposition. However, the work of CARA, and you'll hear more of that, is something that speaks to me, not just because I like the idea of supporting new scholars to come to university, and I'm thinking, of course, great contributions to my own project. It's great to have these people in the university to talk about their experience. We need to hear these voices. We need to also have voices of those who can articulate their experiences in a meaningful way. That's what academics are good at. We need those voices in a discourse that has eliminated or hasn't really given much room to the actual experience of war. The colleagues in film studies would undoubtedly agree with me 100%. They have been great in cooperating. So there's a lot of links I can see that would enhance our academic work that we do, but also, and maybe more importantly, that of our collective experience of sharing and taking responsibility and a stand in this world that I don't like very much at all at the moment. I also, and here's the thought that I wanted to leave with, is I think it can be a way of the idea of institutionally engaging with individuals in this refugee crisis. And I know I've heard in previous conversations, the refugee word is not even used. I've been using it almost relentlessly in the last 15 minutes. But since we don't know how to deal with this mass of people, it allows us to see individuals in a group of people that is so often depicted as a big scary mass that's rolling over Europe. But here's a chance to interact with people, with individuals that think very much like us, because they're also academics that have the same language, and it's a model that could easily be replicated in other areas. It could be doctors talking to doctors, nurses talking to nurses, organizations reaching out to professions in the people that are coming in. So to actually make that connection. Not only do I see this as a meaningful way of reaching out and dealing what is a political crisis at the moment, but also a way of really enriching our lives. The economics colleagues who are not, comics in the School of Economics who are not here right now specifically came to remind me to say, Christina, please add migration has positive economic effects for our society. Please mention this at some point, and I can now report back that I have mentioned it. But this strikes me as something, a crisis also is a moment of opportunity. And we can't change it in the global world, have to live together and finding solutions that go beyond throwing bombs on people's homes, but reaching out and working together strikes me as the only way forward. So I'm wholeheartedly committed to this endeavor. Thank you.
I would like to start by letting three of the people we're now supporting speak to you in their own words about their experiences. All three are Syrians. The first is a woman, the other two are both men. The first one. A few months after I returned to Syria, the conflict started. It became impossible to pursue academic work and research. My students stopped coming to classes. When the conflict reached our neighbourhood, we lost our homes and were forced to move to the countryside. It was very difficult to travel because of the hundreds of security and military checkpoints and the arbitrary arrests. Many of my relatives were killed by rockets, snipers and barrel bombs Most schools were crowded with people who had lost their homes or had moved to find security. Many teachers had stopped working because their salaries were no longer being paid. Students lost years of education and their futures with it. The second, the killing and kidnapping of Syrian intellectuals was a daily occurrence in our lives. My little daughter told me many times, "Do not go to work, please do not, they will kidnap you." My older daughter understood a new and terrifying fact. Her father, who was supposed to protect her, could not even protect himself. And the third, thousands of our schools and educational institutions have been completely destroyed or have become jails and torture centres occupied by the armed groups. The same places we used to go to teach or to learn, the armed men take us to torture us. Many of our scientists and scholars have been killed. Now I feel that no one cares about Syria. All the organisations I've contacted have apologised in one way or another. Today I knock on the door of CARA, my last hope. 3 different voices, 3 personal tragedies, 3 people who now are at least safe with their families, being supported by CARA at universities in the UK and elsewhere, where they can start to rebuild their lives and their futures. For over 80 years, academics like these, university teachers and researchers, have been seeking our help. Our origins go back to one of Europe's biggest disasters, the rise of the Nazis to power in 1933, and the beginning of our continent's descent into darkness and war. By chance, a British academic, William Beveridge, who was then the director of the London School of Economics, was travelling in Europe in the spring of that year and heard what was starting to happen. In particular, he heard about the expulsion of Jewish academics from Germany's universities. He was appalled at what that would mean, not just for the individuals and their families, but also for the future of learning and scholarship in Europe and the wider world. He returned to London and spoke to many of his colleagues. And in just over a month, 40 of them came together to set up what they called originally the Academic Assistance Council, with a clear double mandate, not just the relief of suffering, but also the defence of learning and science. They summed up their goal as being to prevent the waste of exceptional abilities exceptionally trained. It wasn't an easy task. Then as now, there were many forces opposed to the idea of welcoming refugees, however highly trained they might be. The government worried that admitting large numbers might cause social unrest, and in particular the fact that many were Jewish made them worry about the risk of anti-Semitism being stirred up. Not even all British academics were keen. The Academic Assistance Council had been founded by those at the top of their institutions, but some others lower down were more anxious about foreigners coming in and taking their jobs. Nevertheless, over time, the major problems were overcome. Between 1933 and 1939, some 2,000 people were helped to escape and were supported while they found new positions in the UK or elsewhere. Some were well connected and needed little more than a cup of tea and a friendly word of advice. Others needed rather more help. Many settled in the UK, but some passed through, going on to other countries where they'd be safe. It is said that the philosopher Karl Popper never quite forgave us for encouraging him to move on to New Zealand, where he had to remain throughout the war years, which he found very boring, far too many sheep. But he did produce some of his best work while he was there. Many others also went on to achieve great success, including 16 Nobel Prize winners. Some made very important contributions to the British war effort and the defeat of Hitler. Others achieved lasting reputation in other ways. A neurologist from Breslau, for example, Ludwig Guttmann, who pioneered the use of sport to treat spinal injury patients at Stoke Mandeville Hospital, motivated them to recover by organising competitions which grew into international competitions, which became the Paralympic Games. Our founders were first motivated by the desire to help the victims of fascism. But after the war, they realised the mission was not over. As communist regimes were imposed across Eastern Europe, independently minded intellectuals once again became a target for many of the new governments and were forced to leave. Uprisings followed by repression in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 forced many more academics to seek sanctuary abroad. And our horizons widened beyond Europe too, to apartheid South Africa, to South America under military juntas, to other parts of Africa and the Middle East, essentially anywhere where dissent was being silenced. Today, over 80 years since CARA was founded, many things have changed, but too many have not. Persecution and violence are still disfiguring many countries around the world. and academics and scientists are still being forced to flee. Many of them today still turn to us. Some of them are human rights defenders, standing up for intellectual and academic freedom. They may have sought to expose government corruption and abuses, or to resist the attempts of extremists to impose their dogmas on every aspect of daily life. In return, they were arrested, beaten, or threatened with death. Others are singled out, apparently, just because they are educated, and so are a potential opposition. In Iraq, for example, over 450 academics have been deliberately murdered since 2003. In recent months, the advance of so-called ISIS into cities such as Mosul, with its large university community, has added a further level of horror, with reports of academics that are being publicly executed. Women academics are particularly vulnerable when extremism flourishes. As their students are radicalized, they may start receiving threats about the way they dress, the way they behave, the fact they're there teaching at all. Eventually, some are sent a bullet in an envelope with a very clear message that the next time, unless they submit, they won't see it coming. For others, the risk may not be as personal, but the result of a wider conflict in which their universities are caught up. Their normal route to work is suddenly broken up by checkpoints, where aggressive soldiers with guns swinging from their shoulders demand papers with the ever-present risk of forcible conscription into the regime's armed forces. As law and order breaks down, colleagues are kidnapped and held for ransom by criminal gangs. Academics are often seen as being well paid with regular salaries and so worth snatching. Lectures are punctuated by the blast of mortar shells and barrel bombs falling on the neighbourhoods nearby. And others face persecution and violence for very personal reasons, because of their ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. Whatever the crisis that is forcing them to flee, we aim to help as many as we can, still guided by our founders' twin aims, the relief of suffering and the defence of learning and science, helping academics who are suffering persecution or violence to find refuge quickly in a safe place where they can continue their work through our fellowship programme. Unsurprisingly, the great majority of those seeking help today come from Syria. Over recent months, our newspapers and TV bulletins have been full of pictures of desperate people fleeing conflict in the Middle East, often taking appalling risks to get to a place where they and their families can be safe. Much of the popular narrative accompanying the pictures has quite naturally been of refugees and people being forced to seek asylum. Actually, we find the reality is much more interesting than that. Overwhelmingly, the people who are turning to us for support do not see themselves as refugees. They do not want to seek asylum. They don't want to leave their home countries forever. They clearly understand that they and their skills will be needed there again once the situation allows them to return. So what they're looking for is not a new permanent home, but a place where they, and in many cases their families, will be safe for perhaps a few years, where they can maintain and develop the skills and build the networks they will need when they go back to help in the building of better and safer societies. And that is what we try to provide with the active support of a growing number of universities in the UK, and also now in France, Germany, Australia and Canada. In most cases, the first approach to us comes by email or mobile phone. Strange as it may seem, in view of all the disasters taking place, most people still seem able to establish contact, even if they only have power for a few hours a day, or have to travel across their city, often at great personal risk, to get connected. They tell us their stories and they outline what they want to do. Depending on what stage they're at in their careers, and on whether their existing qualifications are recognised abroad, some of those applying for help want to do postgraduate qualifications, masters or PhDs. Others may be looking to do postdoctoral research. A few may have studied abroad, but many have little idea how universities in the UK or Europe work and don't know where they can go. Once we've established contact, we always ask for academic references to be sure that they are who they claim to be, and start the process of trying to match them up with the host institution. In 2006, we established a UK universities network with 15 institutions. It now has 112, including Reading. And we have got to know those universities very well. Between us, we can usually work out a match, or sometimes one university can direct us to a colleague nearby who might be able to help at a different university. Where possible, we encourage the university and the applicant to talk to each other by Skype, so they can really work out if the academic match is going to work. But of course, it's not only about that. In many cases, they have families as well, partners and children who will need to be provided for with suitable accommodation, so we can be as sure as we can that the whole family, some of whom may also need counselling for trauma, are going to get the help they need. Then we have to sort out the finances. Always the hardest part. There are always more people needing help than we can support from our own resources, so we ask the hosting university to waive fees. We raise money from our fellowship awards, for our fellowship awards from a range of trusts and foundations, but it's never enough, and the present crisis means we have many more people needing help than we can actually fund. So increasingly we've gone back to universities, seeing if they can cover more of the living costs. Some have responded very generously, offering to take on the full costs. Others can provide perhaps a room or a bursary or some other form of support. Then when all the details of the placement have been worked out, we come to the final, and rather in some ways the steepest hurdle, which is working with the universities to ensure that the applicants and their families all get the necessary visas. This is never easy, particularly now when the rules are being tightened day after day. But our experience shows that if we and the universities take care to get the details right, then usually the end result works out. Putting it all like that makes it sound dry and bureaucratic, and in some ways it is. There are lots of forms to fill in, lots of boxes to tick and I's to dot and T's to cross. But it's impossible to forget while we're doing all this that the very real dramas the people we're helping have been going through. Take, for example, the case of Mohammed and Juri, two Syrian academics, a married couple, who are now safe with their young son at university in Scotland. As their students started to disappear, and after several of their colleagues had been kidnapped, they decided they had to get away. They split up to improve their chances. Mohammed went over the border to a refugee camp in Jordan, while Juri went to Beirut. That didn't work out, and they moved on to the Gulf, to UAE, where they tried to find work, but were banned from working. They then moved on to Kuwait, where they were again prevented from working, and Mohammed was eventually imprisoned for overstaying his visa. They finally made their way back to Turkey, where they first contacted us. And after that, as I say, we got them back to the UK and to Scotland. Another young Syrian academic we are now helping had a series of violent incidents on his doorstep. His 10-year-old son was going to a school nearby, and a car bomb exploded just at the time the kids were coming out of school. He ran there and found his son traumatized among some 40 bodies. As fighting spread to their neighborhood, corpses were left lying on both sides of the street, with dogs eating them, and regime forces covering the street would shoot anybody who came near to try and bury them or clear them away. He and his family, with 5 small children altogether, eventually fled. And after travelling through Lebanon, they ended up in Jordan as refugees, unemployed, with no prospects and no support, where they first contacted us. He's just finished his first year at one university here and is now moving to a second. As I've said, most of those we're now helping say they want to return home, and over 90% of the Iraqi academics we helped a couple of years ago did just that. Many find it easier to go back because they know that if things go wrong again, we're still there and can help them again. As we did very recently in the case of one chap who unfortunately went back to Mosul University and then had to get out again when ISIS took over. He actually contacted us by mobile phone from a basement and asked if we could get him back to his university in Wales if he got as far as Turkey. We said we could do that if he could make the first step, and fortunately he did, and he is now safe again, though he left his 18-year-old son behind who couldn't travel with him. Those who do return home to their own countries successfully often take with them the knowledge and experience they've learned here, and also the connections they made. And some lasting partnerships have now been established between universities in the UK and in Iraq on the basis of those partnerships. Some, of course, cannot go back home, but there are some for whom the risks will always be too great, for whatever reason, and they need to rebuild their lives here in the longer term. Take, for example, one lady called Ethel from Zimbabwe, currently finishing a PhD. She was subject to state harassment, initially because her husband was involved with the movement for democratic change. He eventually was forced to flee abroad. She was working at university and tried to stay on and look after her kids at the same time. But the pressure was put on her then. She was eventually accused of teaching her students about the MDC, and she too had to leave. She contacted us, and as I say, she's finishing a PhD here in the UK. Another chap called Etana from Ethiopia, who was one of 50 lecturers from the Oromo national minority, who was dismissed for supposedly supporting the Oromo Liberation Front. He continued his studies on Oromo history at another university and was given the opportunity to present a paper in the USA. On his return, he was called in and warned. And when his master's thesis was published as a book in Germany, he was ordered to write a counter-thesis. When he refused, he was arrested. He was released. Eventually, he visited the UK. While he was away, officials raided his house, took his computer, beat up his wife. He stayed in the UK, she managed to get out and join him, and he's now finishing his PhD here as well. What is most remarkable when you actually meet these people, having read their stories, is just how normal most of them seem. Like many other university people all around the world, they had a plan for their future, they had their dreams of an academic life. In their cases, it turned into a nightmare. We're currently supporting around 140 people like that, with around 200 dependents, on top of which we're in touch with over 100 more, mostly from Syria, or mostly still in Syria, for whom we are still trying to find both places and funding. This is a business which doesn't unfortunately come to an end. But of course, not everybody, even in those circumstances, wants to leave or can leave. Some people are still determined to carry on working with their students, with their institutions for as long as they can. And so for them, we have, in different cases, put together what we call regional programs. We did one for Iraq recently, which ran through an office in Jordan, and was aiming to link up Iraqi academics still in the country with those in the surrounding region, and with academics in the UK and elsewhere, doing research projects of things that were directly relevant to Iraq's situation at the time. So we received different bids, those bids were analysed and the awards were made. One team was looking, for example, at which plants are best at removing contamination from soil, particularly depleted uranium contamination. Another was putting together mobile phone technology with portable blood sugar meters for diabetes monitoring. Others were looking at things like how you put together a non-sectarian school curriculum in a country which is riven by sectarianism. We also established regional roundtables, linking them up with academics from the surrounding countries, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Turkey and Lebanon, looking particularly at social sciences, gender issues, these sort of things, and then feeding the results back into the Iraqi ministries as they were all being established. In Zimbabwe, there's a slide going around there, we had a rather different problem, where essentially it was not because of conflict, but because of the very politicized university system there, which meant that many, all vice-chancellors were Mugabe appointees, and many departments that were seen as disloyal suddenly found their funding cut off. So you had medical departments that couldn't work because they had no funds to buy spare parts for fridges, and there were no working fridges. You had lecturers who, also because of the economic crisis, who hadn't been paid, but also partly because they had no funds in the faculty. And we put together a program which firstly provided small grants to cover the cost of urgent spare parts, but also established a cinema-style screen linked to electronics, so those outside the country could deliver lectures in real time back to the universities. And we focused on health sciences and veterinary science, which are things which were clearly in need of the greatest support, but also were totally non-political. And that system ran for about a year and a half in its original form, and fortunately now the situation has eased a bit, and it is still working, and we've supplied a mobile screen which is now being used for smaller things like PhD vivas, masters seminars and so on. But again, allowing people outside still to work with their former students and their colleagues back in the university. And right now we're working on what we can do for Syrian academics. We've got a consultant we've engaged to try to put together a program, drawing in particular on the experience of our Iraq work, and trying to see what, where the need is, where the academics are, what help they need, what would most fit that need, and whether we and others together can help provide it for those in the region. And so our work continues. Only one person so far has needed our help twice. Justice Albie Sachs of South Africa, there he is, on cue, who we helped first in 1966. He was a young white lawyer in South Africa involved with the anti-apartheid movement, and was arrested and held under the 90-day rule, which essentially allowed them to hold you in isolation for 90 days, and then for a further 90 days, and a further 90 days for as long as they liked. After several rounds of that, he was psychologically pretty smashed up. He was released. He came to the UK. We supported him then. He went back to Mozambique, carried on with the anti-apartheid movement, and in 1988 they put a car bomb in his car. Fortunately, they hadn't noticed that his wasn't a regular car, and the steering wheel was on the other side. So they put the bomb onto the wrong seat. So he lost an arm and an eye, but wasn't actually killed. But he wrote to us a year or so ago, summing up what we had meant to him. In his words, "My story has been repeated 1,000 times and more with different details but the same theme. An intellectual driven from his or her homeland by repression and intolerance, enabled by CARA to share ideas and values with the welcoming hosts and improving skills. Through living the principles of free inquiry, we become the natural apostles of peace and understanding, and of internationalism at its best." That is still our goal. not just the rescuing of lives, as important as that is, but the defence of learning itself, of intellectual and academic freedom, and through that, the development of a better, safer world. We are committed to the ideal that science and learning have no geographical boundaries, that the pursuit of excellence is international, that academics and higher education and research form one global community whose work is essential for peaceful development. I recognise the political climate for our work is becoming more difficult. The latest tragic events in Paris in particular are, as we see, leading to a hardening of attitudes in public towards refugees and towards foreigners more widely in many countries. But we have been here before. We remember the public and political hostility which our founders had to face in the 1930s. We remember also that when war broke out in 1939, many of those whom they had rescued over the previous 6 years were rounded up as hostile enemy aliens and put in internment camps. And it took our predecessors about 6 months to get them free again. So we must continue to fight against ignorance and to make the point that those whom we help today, far from being a danger, will enrich our institutions and societies while they're here, as those we helped in the 1930s and in subsequent decades did then, and will also have an irreplaceable role in rebuilding when they're finally able to go home. I'll stop there, but I would just like to say that everything we do with and through the universities in this country. You mentioned earlier some of the support that we get from Reading. Many other universities help us as well. Without that we couldn't function. So we're very grateful to the university and to all our universities and to everybody who takes an interest, because ultimately as a charity we rely on support to do what we do. Thank you.